of Social Sciences, New Delhi, and Dr. Barender Kumar, who is a visiting fellow at IGIDR Mumbai. Sir, we are really honored to have you with us, and we are glad that you took out time for us, and it would be a pleasure to hear you speak. Before starting with the proceedings, now I would like to invite our principal, Dr. Gyantosh Kumar Jha, to welcome our guests.
Honorable Professor Arun Kumar and Dr. Virendra Kumar Roy, on behalf of our college, I welcome our guest speaker and all the participants in this webinar on the subject impact of COVID-19, the economic impact of COVID-19. I am very glad and feel honored that both the dignitaries have given their valuable time for this webinar, and they will enlighten with their thoughts. And in fact, we will be able to understand the economic situation of the country after and during this COVID-19 pandemic, and during this lockdown and after the lockdown. I am thankful to the webinar committee. I congratulate them that they have organized this webinar for the benefit of students and teachers and for the understanding of country's situation, economic situation, because we have seen in the past that many of the laborers and many of the people who have become now jobless, and they were moving on the road in the lockdown period. So they were facing very pathetic situation. So it will be very helpful for all of us. Once again, I welcome both the dignitaries, both the speakers, Professor Arun Kumar and Dr. Barender Kumar Bhoi. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Professor Arun Kumar retired from the Center for Economic Studies and Planning, Jawaharlal Nehru University in 2015. He is currently professor at the Institute of Social Sciences. He has an MA in Physics from Princeton University, USA, and Delhi University, and PhD in Economics from JNU. He has written many books like The Black Economy in India by Penguin, Understanding Black Economy and Black Money. He has also written Indian Economy Since Independence, Persisting Colonial Disruption by Vision Books. He authored the alternative budgets for 1993-94 and 1994-95. He has written extensively in journals and in popular press. His latest book on GST, titled Ground Scorching Tax, was released in February 2019. I welcome you again, sir. And now I invite Professor Arun Kumar to deliver his speech. Thank you, sir.
So, thank you for inviting me to give this talk. I'm grateful to the principal and to Apara for organizing all this. I have a PPT which unfortunately I'm not able to project, but I'll speak from that. And the title that I have given to the talk is Lockdown and After, the Economy, Unorganized Sector and the Way Forward. And the reason I've specifically mentioned the unorganized sector is because they are the ones who are going to be very badly affected by this lockdown that has taken place. And post the lockdown also, they are likely to suffer. So whatever I'm going to say is only a brief sketch, but I have written a lot since March 6th in the Hindu, in EPW, in the Wire, in the India Legal, and various other places. So for greater details, you can actually look at some of these articles that I've been writing. And one of the questions that I addressed, my architect friend, he called me on 25th of March, when the lockdown was implemented. He said, how's the economy running? when most of the people under partial lockdown were at home. People are not traveling, factories were shutting down, etc. So he's asking that question, that in a lockdown, how does an economy work? And now we have lockdown in large number of countries. So large number of countries are largely shut down in terms of production, in terms of offices and so on. So the question is, what is happening during the lockdown and what can happen after the lockdown? And you can see that economic activity has come to a more or less a halt, except for the production of essentials. So you have empty roads, you have closed markets, shops are closed. Consumption of diesel and electricity has declined by 30%. There's a drastic fall in air and water pollution. You can see the Himalayas clearly from Jalandhar, from 250 kilometers away in West Bengal. So all this is an indication that economic activity has more or less come to a halt. So in a complete lockdown, when many countries go into a lockdown simultaneously, what is likely to happen? That's what I'm trying to address. And what I have been arguing is that except for the essentials like agriculture, medicines, some FMCG goods, almost everything else has come to a stop. As the report came in the Economic Times a few days back, that April will be the first month in the history of Indian automobile industry where there'd be zero car sale. So this is an indication of what is happening. Now, the situation is worse than in a world war that we had, in 1939 to 45, or the global financial crisis of 2007-9. And the reason is that during a war, there's no unemployment. People are occupied, producing for the war. They are occupied, as soldiers and so on and so forth. So demand is not short. But you can see that now in the US, in the 6 weeks of implementation of the lockdown there, more than 30 million people have filed for claim under unemployment. And in India, hundreds of millions of workers have not been able to go to work. So they are unemployed. So in a sense, now unemployment is there and production is not taking place, which is quite different from what happens during a world war. And during the global financial crisis, which was brought about by the subprime crisis and the financial distress, actually it was demand that fell short, and that is what a usual business cycle model is. But now it's not a question of demand shortage alone, it's a question of supply being also stopped. Factories are not working, offices are not working, so supply is not taking place, and because the incomes are not being generated, so demand is also fallen. So therefore, it's a different kind of an emergency than was during the World War or during the global financial crisis. And such a situation has never been faced before. But to be sure, it's first a medical emergency, because if the disease spreads, a lot of people can die. And that's why the economic hardship is linked to the medical emergency. And the two of them are interlinked. So the question is, why do we have a lockdown at all? Now, the lockdown is needed because the virus is highly infectious and spreads from human to human. This is a mutation of a virus that was apparently in some animal. We don't know what animal, etc., but people guessed it was the bats. But in the wet market in Wuhan, from where it spread, it obviously jumped from animals to humans and then has been transmitting from humans to humans. Now, some people argue that, okay, let it spread, what is called the herd immunity. And if it spreads, ultimately people will become immune to it. But the cost will be very, very high, because if it spreads to, say, something like 60 or 70% of Indians, there'll be about 800 million Indians. And if only 2% die, then you can see that, roughly about, some like 17, 18 million, 1.7, 1.8 crore people could die. But in India, because of poverty and lack of medical facilities, 5% could be severe cases. And if 5% people die in the entire population of 1.3 billion, then 65 million or 6.5 crore people would die. And that would lead to social chaos and societal breakdown. And we have to worry that our medical facilities are very inadequate and they should not be overwhelmed. That is why there's something called the apex. Apex is when the disease reaches a peak. That peak should be below the capability of the medical system. So that's why this is called the flattening of the curve. When you lock down and you don't allow people to move around, then the disease spread slows down, And when that slows down and that remains below the medical capability, then you are able to deal with it. But if it crosses the limit of the medical facilities, then the medical facilities will break down and people will not get cured and large number of people will begin to die. As happened in Spain, when the fumigation people from the army, they went to various medical facilities, they found that, large number of patients who were elderly had been abandoned, because the medical system felt that they could not protect them. So they were trying to protect the younger people rather than the older people, and the older people were just left to die. So if the systems get overwhelmed, there can be a societal breakdown. So in a sense, lockdown is only buying time so that society doesn't break down. Lockdown is not a cure for the disease. So lockdown does two things. One is it delays the spread till a vaccine or a medicine is discovered, and it also gives you time to ramp up testing and to ramp up the medical facilities that are available in the system. And the second, as I said, is to keep the apex below the medical capacity so as to curtail the spread of the disease. So these are the two things that the lockdown achieves. Now, what is the impact of the lockdown? Lockdown means that very few people are out and they cannot mix with each other. But the poor people, if they don't go to work, then they don't have an income. So poor people earn daily and buy their essentials daily. They cannot stock up like the middle class and the upper middle classes who can buy for a month or 2 months to take care of the lockdown. So as soon as their income stops, they begin to starve. They don't have money to take care of themselves. At best, they can take care of maybe a few days or maybe a week. And that's why large number of people wanted to migrate back to their own villages from where they had come, because they thought that there at least they would, get food, from the fields. Now, so therefore, the situation became quite desperate, and there were people who are willing to walk 1,000 kilometers, even though they had little food, they had small amount of belonging on their back or their head. With little children, they were walking, and in some cases, people also died. So people are saying, those who are migrating, that it is better to die with one's own family rather to die alone in the city. So what it shows is that people have become fearful of death due to the pandemic, and they want to go back. Now, when they go back, and especially after this big fear, they are unlikely to return soon. And that's why the demand for the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme has shot up after 14th April. The data from Rajasthan shows that the demand for this Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme shot up by a factor of 10. In Maharashtra, it shot up by a factor of 2.5 within just days of 14th of April, when the lockdown was partly relaxed on 14th of April. So what it shows is the large number of people have gone back, and as soon as the relaxation takes place, many more will go back because of the fear and because they want to be with their families. It's natural to understand that they want to be with their families in this period of crisis rather than be alone. Now, so what are the imperatives of a lockdown? How can we make the lockdown successful? A lockdown is very difficult to implement in India because of the huge amount of poverty. Even though the number of people below poverty line may be coming down, but those above it who are still poor, their numbers are very, very large. And those who get unemployed, they then slip below the poverty line. So today we are paying for our highly unequal system, and a system in which the poor people live in very congested climate, in very uncivilized conditions. They don't have clean water, they don't have proper toilet facilities, they don't have the day-to-day requirements of keeping hygiene, etc. So in that situation, how is isolation possible? You hear of reports in Bombay of 10 people, 15 people living in a room because they used to come and sleep in shifts. But now that the businesses have closed down, they have to be in the room. I know my own staff here at my place, they live in a village close by here in Gurgaon, and there are 4 or 5 people, living in a room. So it's very difficult to do isolation. They have to go out for food, etc. So for lockdown to be successful, we need to give the essentials to the poor people wherever they are, and that has to be given free because they have no income. And the second thing that's needed is to decongest the poor people from wherever they are. And for this purpose, we can use schools, we can use halls, we can use open grounds and set up tent colonies so that at least the density of population is reduced so that the isolation becomes possible. If we don't do this, then the crisis will continue. So this is a crisis situation in which, very bold steps will have to be taken, like decongestion and provision of essentials to the poor people wherever they are. Now, why does all this happen in a modern day economy? That's what something we need to understand. And that is a result of what we call the division of labor in economics. There's so much division of labor, which is based on specialization, that we don't produce almost anything apart from the work that we are doing. So in our homes, we use hundreds of things, but we don't produce them, we buy them from outside. So if the situation deteriorates, we can't even make a spoon for ourselves, forget about making paper or computers or other such things. So even in the villages, the earlier self-sufficiency of village life is gone. They have to buy fertilizers from outside, they buy seeds from outside, they buy implements from outside. So even villages are no more self-sufficient. So therefore, there's the institution of market. In the market, we come and we exchange. So what one person produces, the other person produces something else, and we exchange it using money. So the market is where, because of the high degree of division of labor, we are exchanging things and getting it. But now the markets have shut down, the production have shut down, and therefore all this market mechanism is not working. Okay, and it is in the market that you get the income and, by doing some work, and that then you purchase other things. So for instance, if your spouse does work at home, you don't pay the spouse. But if you hire somebody to come from outside, you pay. So in the GDP, when a maid comes to the home and does work, that gets counted. But if the wife is doing work, that is not counting. And the reason is that we are exchanging our labor for her labor. And that's why it gets counted. But in a division of labor, when there's a high division of labor, we get dependent on outside. And that's what creates the problem. Now, think about a Robinson Crusoe, which we study in economics, who's marooned alone on an island. Now, the Robinson Crusoe has to produce everything, from the clothing, from water to food to housing. And therefore, it doesn't have time for any luxury. It's a very rudimentary life. You're busy all the time. But in today's society, because of this division of labor, we have a lot of capital of different kinds, which is spread out all across, which is producing different things. And we then get all that. So in a lockdown, people cannot go to the place of work, so production halts, and therefore the availability of goods and services in society, that starts coming down dramatically. Hello. Now, so the second thing about modern day production is it's concentrated in some pockets. So there are large factories in some pockets. So like say, for instance, in Manesar, you'll have car production. In Tamil Nadu, near Chennai, you'll have car production, and they'll be supplied all over the country. Or you have, food production. Hello? Some disturbance? So, there is food production in some pockets like Punjab and Haryana and West UP, and that then goes everywhere. There's rice production in certain pockets that goes everywhere. So what happens is that to do this kind of concentrated production, you require finance, you require trade, you require transportation. So today there are global supply chains, so no nation even is self-sufficient. And for instance, China has become the hub for global supply of most manufactured items, and as soon as problems began in China, the global supply chain started getting disturbed. So you can see that, when production doesn't take place, global supply chains start getting disturbed and production starts coming to a halt. Now, to carry on production, you require some input. Without an input, you cannot produce. So if you want to produce cloth, you need to have a thread. For producing thread, you need to have cotton, and to produce some clothing, you need to have textile and buttons and thread, etc., etc. So these are called inputs. You need inputs to produce something, and therefore you need to have a stock of inputs, what are called inventories. And when you produce the textile, you hold a certain amount of inventory. So therefore, the production structure also depends on holding inventories, and inventories have a financial cost, because you need to borrow the money from the bank, what is called the working capital, and on that borrowed capital, you have to pay an interest. So what does lockdown do? Workers cannot go to work, the machines and offset. And second, supplies of inputs are disrupted, so production largely stops. So even though workers and capital both exist, production stops. And as soon as production stops, your costs start mounting, because you have to keep on paying interest on the working capital and for the inventories. So in India, we have production which is a very diversified production. In most economies, you simply have large scale and small scale. But in India, we have large scale, small scale, medium scale, and cottage sector, and the unorganized sector, which is the cottage sector. So working capital which is needed to buy raw materials, to pay the wages of workers, etc. The large scale businesses, okay, they have a lot of capital, okay, they can buy it, but the small scale in the cottage sector has very little of it. And then in addition, to set up a factory, to set up buildings, etc., you take loans. So in other words, the businesses work on a lot of debt on which they have to pay interest. So how do they pay interest? They sell their goods, they sell their services, and through that they generate a revenue, and that revenue is then used to pay the interest. So if sales stop, the repayment of loans or payment of interest becomes difficult because income is not coming in, revenue is not coming in, and that's when businesses begin to fail. So if production you continue when sales have stopped, what happens? Your inventory start mounting, and therefore working capital gets requirement increases, and therefore more interest has to be paid, and therefore losses begin to mount further, and that's why you cannot continue to produce when the sales have stopped, and that's why the production comes to a halt. So working capital shortages increase as a result of this. Now, what is the impact of all this? Healthy companies are those which have large reserves, but they have to use the reserves to hold the inventory and continue to pay the workers. That means they're starting to dissave. There are weak companies or small units which have very little of working capital, or they have no reserves. They start dissaving, and therefore they start defaulting on the loans, and they begin to fail. The cottage sector, which is the small and the unorganized sector, and the cottage sector, there what happens is the owners have their own savings which they're using as working capital. But in a lockdown, they need to use that saving for consumption. So therefore, their capital also goes down. So in other words, whether it's the large scale or the medium scale or the weak companies or the strong companies or the small and the cottage sector, all of them start dissaving. All of them start using up their capital or increasing their working capital requirement. So they need funds from the banks. But where do banks get the funds? People who are savers, who are salaried employed, and the workers, they are depositing their savings in the bank. And the banks then give the loan to the businesses which require it. So when banks don't get interest payment, or the loan is not returned, then what happens? They begin to lose their reserves. And that is their dissaving, and then they get into trouble. Their NPAs start rising. So the effect of all this is that working capital is which is a part of investment, that starts going down, and that means investment starts going down. And when investment starts going down, then the production starts going down. So when production starts going down, workers don't get wages, and therefore their demand goes down. So all in all, what happens is there's a vicious cycle in which, starting with the closure of factories, etc., the demand begins to fall. Production capacity becomes idle. And when production capacity becomes idle, then investment further falls. And when that happens, then further there's a decline in incomes and consumption. And therefore there's a vicious cycle in which demand falls, production slows down, investment slows down, etc. So this is a vicious cycle within which the economy starts working. What's happening to savings? Now, savings are the balance of income left after consumption. I, as a teacher, I'm working, and I get an income. Then after that, I consume out of that, and whatever is left, that's my savings. But if my income collapses, then savings also collapse. Not only that, for consumption, I have to use my past savings and then spend on my consumption. So in other words, I'm dissaving out of the deposit that I had made earlier. So businesses are dissaving, consumers are dissaving, so everybody in the economy is dissaving so that the essentials can continue. Now, if you think about it, it is in this milieu that the central bank tries to boost the economy. But what does the interest rate reduction by the central bank do? The interest rate has been cut, the repo rate, the reverse repo rate, they've been cut. But that has no impact on the business climate because businesses are shut. When the businesses are shut, then investment will not take place even if you lower interest rate. That's what we saw in the 2007 to 9 global financial crisis also. Interest rates were cut to almost zero in UK, in USA, in Japan, they became even negative. And similarly, last year also in Germany and Japan, you had negative interest rates, and yet investment is not there. And the reason investment doesn't come up is because if you are only producing 25% or 30% of your output, you have 70% capacity left. So why would you try to produce more? So therefore, even though the central bank, the Reserve Bank of India, has cut interest rates, they have tried to introduce liquidity into the market. But because the businesses are shut, they're not producing, they don't need credit, and therefore the investment will not pick up. And what are the banks doing? The banks which are flush with liquidity, they are only depositing it back in the RBI. So the reverse repo rate was cut so that the banks could lend to others, but others don't need bank lending, and therefore the banks are depositing 7 lakh crores in the RBI. And the RBI policy of boosting the economy, introducing liquidity, that will not work as long as large number of businesses are shut. Now, what is the impact on the unorganized sector? Unorganized sector or the poor have low incomes and savings, as I said to you earlier. And when their income stops, their consumption drastically falls. And that's why, as I said earlier, the reverse migration from cities to the villages is taking place. So this is the reason why all this is happening, is that we have a model of very uneven development, which is forcing people to migrate. And this model will have to be re-examined once the pandemic is over and once we have taken care of the problem. So the cottage sector producers, as I was saying earlier, they have exhausted their savings and they're in the process of shutting down. And along with these cottage sector producers, there are a lot of unorganized sectors, self-employed workers like khomcha wala, the fellow who comes on the redi patri wala, the barber, you know, the plumber, the carpenter. They all stand in the chalk for work. All of them have exhausted their savings and they are therefore in crisis. So unorganized sector has lost large amount of employment and therefore their consumption has become a huge problem. Now, what about the organized sector? Organized sector employees have fixed incomes and they are getting some part of their salaries, even though the government has said that the salary should be paid, but the businesses say that we cannot pay salaries beyond a month or so. And that's why many of the businesses are firing people, or they're asking people to resign, you know, rather than firing them, because the government has said that please don't fire people. But organized sector is also losing employment because organized sector companies are also facing this problem. So organized sector also, where people are losing, they cannot continue their consumption of essentials beyond a couple of months. The companies, as I said, they are saving, they cannot sustain for very long. Self-employed people, elderly people, retired people who depend on savings in the banks, they are in trouble because the banks are cutting back on interest rate. The government is reducing the RBI is reducing the interest rate. So their incomes are also falling and they'll also be in trouble. So small savers who had invested in the stock market and in the hope that their wealth would increase, you know, that's the people who are retired, etc., or who are small savings, they have suffered big losses because the markets have declined. Similarly, the real estate prices will drop sharply because a lot of businesses will fail and they will sell their property or they'll leave the rental property. And so there'll be a lot of property in the market. As you know, the real estate markets have been stagnant for the last 6-7 years, and now they will fall very badly. So all kinds of wealth, whether it be as fixed deposits, whether it be bank deposits, whether it be share market, mutual funds, whether it be real estate, they'll all decline in value. And this is called the wealth effect. The wealth effect means that people feel less wealthy and therefore they cut back expenditure. So the unorganized sector people, they have cut back their expenditure, and even the organized sector people who have savings, they also will face the wealth effect and they'll cut back on their expenditures also. So there'll be less buying of the luxury items, there'll be less buying of the consumer durables, etc., in the economy in the coming months. Now, what all this will do to businesses? Businesses which are already stressed, they will now face failure. Which are the businesses that are highly stressed? The ones that are highly leveraged firms. And these leveraged firms are the ones which have a lot of borrowing compared to their capital, compared to the equity. So they have a large interest outgo. And so when the production stops, they'll be the first to fail. And many firms in the financial sector are also in this category. We've already seen, you know, like ILFS failed 2 years back, you know, PMC Bank failed, and recently another private sector bank failed, and large number of people are withdrawing their deposits from the other private sector banks and putting them in public sector banks. And this is a big problem, as we saw in the 2007 to 2009 crisis, that as soon as Lehman Brothers failed, many of the financial companies also started failing. And the reason is that the financial firms are interlinked from one to the other. You borrow from one and you lend to another. So if one stops paying to you, then you cannot pay back to the other. So all three begin to fail. So the financial sector is also in a crisis. So apart from the highly leveraged manufacturing and offices, etc., the financial sector firms could also fail. And this is where the 3-month moratorium for payment of interest to banks, that will help to a certain extent. But if the revival is much longer, it's very uncertain. So working capital requirement is going up. And in that case, the failures could be much higher. And when the banks will face the problem that they'll have NPA. So the banks who should be lending working capital, they will not lend working capital to the firms that are weak, because there the chance of failure is higher and NPA becomes more. But these are the companies, these are businesses that need the working capital loan. So in other words, the banks could be in a crisis, and if the banks are in crisis, then the working capital would not be available, and many of the highly leveraged firms, they will simply fail. So this is the problem, that only those companies or businesses which have large reserves, they'll feel less pain and they'll not collapse. But a large number of other businesses, small and cottage businesses, they can fail because they will not have the working capital revive. Now, apart from businesses, we have other sectors like agriculture, mining, forestry, and logging and fishing. These all come from nature, and these are all dispersed activities. So they can continue to operate in a dispersed way. And it's very essential that they continue to do that, because without that, we'll not have enough food. So we need for this to continue. Now, they will face a problem also, agriculture especially. As the income of the vast majority of the unorganized sector falls, the demand for food will go down. And that's why you see that the prices begin to collapse. We saw that during demonetization also, that as soon as the unorganized sector got hit, demand for food declined and the farmers' prices started declining. Now, added to that is the problem that transport is not available, trade is shut down in large parts of the country. So the farmers are not able to move their produce to the mandis, and if they're not able to send the produce to the mandis, then it starts rotting. So you can store food grains and dals, but you can't store vegetables, and you can't store fruits beyond a certain limit. And that's why you have reports of large number of farms allowing their vegetables and fruits to rot rather than harvesting them. So this is the twin problem, that A, the demand will fall, and B, if the trade and transport is not there, then what will happen is that the prices will fall and the farmers' incomes will decline dramatically. So what is the solution? The solution is that the government has to have an expanded procurement system by which whatever the farmers are producing, that is acquired by them, whether through mandis, whether through traders, or whatever be the route, that has to be acquired, and that has to be supplied to the urban areas. So this supply chain has to continue. Now this will take care of the twin problem of A, the farmers, where will they sell, and B, in the urban areas where there's a shortage of food, etc., will take care. So an extended procurement and an extended public distribution is very essential. For this, you require administration, you require transportation, and you have now the administration working only on the disease-related problem, so that administration can continue. And similarly, you have public transportation, buses and trucks, which are lying idle. They can be used to do this bringing from the rural areas to the urban areas. It will be a huge challenge. There's no doubt about it. Nothing like this has been done before. It's a big challenge, but it is a time of crisis where such a big challenge has to be implemented. Now, what about recovery? So lockdown will have to be relaxed in stages as our testing capacity increases. Today, our testing capacity is very low, so we don't even know who's got the disease, which districts have the disease. So many districts which are being declared as no disease, we don't know whether that's because the testing has not been done, etc. So as we can see, as more and more testing is being done, more and more disease is being discovered. And this is something that happened everywhere. The second problem is that there's a fear of a second round attack. As the economy is opened up, the disease would spread because we don't know who has the disease. So as the WHO has been saying, to check the spread of the disease, you have to do test, test, and test. Massive amount of testing. And that's how Germany and South Korea managed to check the spread of the disease in their countries, and they did not have as many deaths. So we need the time to build up our testing capacity, and we need to do that very quickly. So what will happen is that if the second round attack takes place, then as happened in Spanish flu, the second round killed more people than the first round. So there's a fear today, and therefore even if you gradually open up the economy, people are not going to start going to restaurants or to halls or to malls. or wherever there are crowds, people will be even fearful of going to factories. Many people who have gone back to the villages are not likely to come back, so starting production would be difficult. And in this, the consumer sentiment will be way down because people have faced fear. There's a disease, there is a possibility of death. So consumer sentiment will be way down, and so people will not start buying. And similarly, if people don't start buying and the capacity utilization remains low, then investment will not take place. So the question is, will there be an immediate recovery or there will be a gradual recovery? What's called a V-shaped recovery or a gradual U-shaped recovery. Now, if production can only recover gradually, then it will be a U-shaped recovery rather than a V-shaped recovery, and production can only go up gradually because the workers will be short, supply chains will be having a problem, and finally demand will not be there. So in other words, this situation will be one of gradual recovery and unorganized sector failures, as I have been saying earlier. Now, what is the likely rate of growth for the 2021? Because that tells us something about the demand. So today in the lockdown, the economy is not working at more than 25%. You can say some part of agriculture is working, some part of trade and transport is working, but very little. If you go to a market, you see 90% of the shops are closed except for vegetables and some other essential supplies. If you see that travel and transport, that's almost 95% down. Airlines are down 100%. Railways are not transporting people, only transporting freight. So the economy is not working at more than 25%. What it means is that at the moment you have a minus 75% rate of growth. Okay, and even if suppose slowly you begin to open up the economy in another month, and then it takes 1 year to go back to where it was in July 2020, then the rate of growth of the economy for the full year would be minus 35%. Okay, that means the economy will lose 70 lakh crores of production over the 200 lakh crores last year. So GDP would come down to about 130 lakh crores. So therefore, with this resource, you have to now provide for workers, you have to provide for small businesses so that they don't collapse. And you have to provide for a huge health infrastructure and tackling the disease. So you require very tightening of the governance, for all this. But does the government have the resources? How will it fund all this? So taxes are collected from incomes, from production and consumption. But because the GDP is collapsing, production is not taking place. Therefore, GST collection has now fallen to only 10% of what it was. Because incomes are not being generated, so income tax and corporation tax will fall. So my guess is that from 16% tax GDP ratio, it will come down to 8% tax GDP ratio. Okay, and this 8% will be of the lower of the 130 lakh crores. So last year we collected 32 lakh crores of taxes. This year we'll only collect about 10.5 lakh crores of taxes. So there'll be a 22 lakh crore shortfall in tax collection this year from GST, from corporation tax, from income tax and various other sources. And this will also be very high because bulk of the GST is collected from sin goods and from those which are in the high tax bracket. Essentials are all either in zero tax bracket or in the lower tax bracket. So therefore, we are producing essentials mostly. We're not producing the inessentials like cars and sin goods, etc. So therefore, what would have given you more tax, we're not producing that. Where the tax is not being collected, that's what you're producing, and that's why the tax collection will fall dramatically by about 22 lakh crores. Now, if that happens, then you're in deep trouble because last year the fiscal deficit was already running at about 10%. But that 10% was of 200 lakh crores. So of the 130 lakh crores, it will be about 15%. So we are running at a fiscal deficit about 15%. And add to that, we are going to have a shortfall of taxes of 22 lakh crores. Plus, you'll have additional expenses on various things, like on your health expense and providing for the poor, etc. So the usual government expenditures like interest payment, like salaries, defense, travels, meetings, there'll be difficulty in meeting these expenses. And the government will have to curtail many of these expenses to keep the fiscal deficit in check. Otherwise, the fiscal deficit will rise to 30 to 40% level. So public investments can be postponed for now. You don't need to go for grandiose projects because you need to meet the basic package. And I call this a survival package. The survival package means you take care of the health, you take care of providing the essentials to the people in the country, and you take care of business failures that could take place. Because if you don't do that, then the lockdown would not be successful and the disease would expand and the disease would then create a havoc. So the deficit in the budget will rise very dramatically. Now take for instance, large number of people are getting unemployed, they're losing employment in the economy, so they're becoming poor, they have no income. So suppose we support 50% of the population at 50% of the extreme poverty line of World Bank, which is $1.9 per person per day, and you calculate it at 75 rupees to the dollar, okay, that will require some like 18 lakh crores of expenditure. The government, support for the poor, which was announced a month back, that is only 1.7 lakh crores. That's wholly inadequate to do that. But of this 18 lakh crores, you can include the subsidies, you can include the Kisan scheme, etc., and still you'd need some like about 13 to 14 lakh crores of additional expenditure. And on medical expenses, I think you need another lakh or 2 lakh of crores. So you need some like 15 lakh crores of additional expenditure. And because you don't have enough tax resources, so you need to reorient the budget to meeting only these expenditures by cutting everything else. So you don't have money even to give a stimulus to the economy at the moment. And mind you, a stimulus will not work at this point when businesses are closed. Even if you try to raise demand in the economy because production is not taking place, therefore it will not work. So stimulus should be given only when you begin to revive businesses. Without that, if you give a stimulus, it will not have an effect. So that's why I call this a survival package rather than a stimulus. Because in the survival package, you'll be giving money to see that the poor people don't die. You see that the health is taken care of, and you see that small and marginal businesses don't collapse. Because if they collapse, then even when you want to revive the economy, that will not happen. So in other words, if I conclude, you have a situation in which we have machines, we have factories, we have offices, but the economy is stalled. So you can see the Indian economy is going down dramatically at this point of time. There's no way that the Indian economy will have a positive rate of growth. Unfortunately, the IMF has said 1.9% rate of growth for the year. But if the economy is at minus 75% now, and even if it recovers in a V shape and within say 3 months it recovers back to where it was in January, then from then on it will have to have a 12% real rate of growth to show a 2% rate of growth for the year. And before the lockdown, before the pandemic took place, our economy is already slowing down to about 4%. So how will you suddenly boost it to 12% when everybody is fearful, when people will not be able to go back, people will not start working at the full capacity because of fear of the disease? So there's just no way that you can have a positive rate of growth in the economy, as unfortunately the IMF has said. I don't know how they have done the calculation, what are the assumptions, but it's very clear that we are not going to be able to recover for the next 1 year at least, given the fear that's there, given that people are not going to come back from the villages. So labor will be short, factories will not be able to work at full capacity because they'll have to do physical distancing in the factories, in the offices also. So, there'll be a lot of problem in reviving production. So I don't see any revival, very quickly. I don't see the V-shaped recovery. I don't see that within 2 to 3 months, the economy will start humming at the previous level. If you think about China also, the reports were that the Chinese factories have started humming, but its first quarter reports are that it has declined by 7%. The US economy is also declining. So our exports will also not pick up, and when our exports don't pick up, that'll add further to the decline in the economy. So I have no hope that, the stalled economy can begin to revive very quickly in spite of the efforts of the government or the central bank. Now, all this will hit the poor and the unorganized sector producers who have little saving, as I said, and they will need massive support and an expanded PDS system, and the agriculture will require an expanded procurement system so that supplies can be moved from rural to urban areas. And our health infrastructure is going to be very critical. And that's where we are the real laggards. We have not been spending 3% of GDP on our public health. We've never crossed 1.3%. So we need to increase our testing. And that's, as I said earlier, South Korea, Germany are examples of that, where massive testing was done. And along with testing, you need to do tracing. You need to trace who the people were, who these people met, and then have quarantine facilities. Now in India, we don't have enough hospital beds, we don't have enough doctors, we don't have nurses. So we need to do something to step up our health infrastructure. And for this, I've been suggesting that we can use empty schools, we can use empty fields to set up tent colonies, we can use hotels that are lying empty to do quarantine and to decongest the people. So this has to be set up very quickly. Then we have to ramp up the production of masks, of the PPEs. We have to ramp up the production of other things like ventilators. We have to use, like in America, they're asking car factories to produce ventilators. By retooling, we'll also have to do something like that. Because at the moment in the international market, these things are short. We can't import them very quickly. So we have to ramp up our production very quickly ourselves. So the health infrastructure has to be expanded. How will we meet the shortage of doctors, And for that, I think it's very essential that, if retired doctors want to come back, or if the second year, third year, fourth year medical students, who can be trained to be paramedics in a short period of time, nursing students who can be trained quickly to act in that capacity, then only we'll be able to man our, isolation centers in the hospital. So whatever time is available in the coming 1 or 2 months during the lockdown, we need to do that, to ramp up our capacity for health infrastructure. And that'll require massive investment, which I think at this point we should need to do. So government's resources will be greatly stretched, as I said, because tax collection will come down, expenditures will rise up very sharply, and therefore the government's resource position will be very, very tight. I think the fiscal deficit will be, in the US, they're already planning to spend some like 20% of GDP on the package. In Britain also similarly, in other countries also, they're all planning 15%, 20% of the package. We gave a package of only 0.8% of GDP for the 3 months. We also need to, I think, increase our fiscal package to 20 to 30% if we are to meet the challenge that is there. So today we are facing a huge challenge, okay, and that challenge is coming because of uneven development. Uneven development meant that we had large amount of unorganized sector workers living in very poor conditions where isolation is almost impossible. So we need to rethink our basic development paradigm. We have to rethink about trade, about openness, about environment, about travel. And this is not just India. I think all countries will begin to rethink the model of globalization that was thought of in the last 30, 40 years, and to see how we can be more self-sufficient so that even when there's a disruption, and mind you, these pandemics will keep coming. We are lucky that, the previous pandemics like Ebola, SARS, MERS, that didn't affect India that much. But this one, the COVID-19, that has hit us very badly. And that is exposing the very poor systems that we have, the social systems, where we have large number of slums, people living in very, very poor conditions, with very little income, hardly any savings to take care of themselves. They are very precarious. And therefore, we need to really rethink our development paradigm, the kind of trade, openness, etc., as I said, and also the environment. People are saying that because of the environmental destruction, large number of animals are forced to live close to human beings. Like bats is given as one example, and that, then leads to viruses jumping from animals to human beings. So even if we didn't have this, the viruses can mutate and can cause a pandemic, and there can be a pandemic which is even worse than what this present pandemic is. Could be more. This one is less virulent, say, than Ebola, but another pandemic could be with a virus which is as virulent as Ebola and spreads as fast as this COVID-19 spreads. And that would be deadly, because then we won't even have time to really, build up our systems. So building up public health systems, keeping, population in a safe way, with adequate incomes for food and living, improvement of living conditions, all these things will have to be thought through. Thanks for your patience.
Thank you, sir, for this enlightening and informative session. And hopefully all of us will be able to make most of this session. Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
We'll be entertaining questions after our second session. Is it fine, sir?
Okay.
Dr. Barender Kumar Bhoi is a career central banker and an economist. He served the Reserve Bank of India for more than 3 decades. since 1984 and held several responsible positions, including Principal Advisor and Head of the Monetary Policy Department at RBI during 2014 to 2016. He served as Chief General Manager or Head of the Research Department at Securities and Exchange Board of India during 2005 to 2007, and as Economic Policy Expert at Central Bank of Oman during 2009-2010. Currently, Dr. Bhoy is a visiting fellow at IGIDR Mumbai. He is also an independent consultant to private equities, mutual funds, etc. He has published 23 research articles and 7 book reviews in reputed economics journals in India as well as abroad. In addition to 34 articles in leading financial dailies. Dr. Bhoy's research interest mainly focuses on monetary economics, international trade, and macroeconomics. I welcome you again, sir, and invite you to deliver your talk.
Thank you for inviting me to share my thoughts with the researchers as well as the faculties. It has become somewhat easy for me now to go ahead with what I have thought that I should share with you about the impact of COVID-19 on Indian economy and the way forward. So my presentation would be a two-part agenda. The first part will be the impact of COVID-19 on Indian economy, and second part would be way forward. Now, way forward anyway is very uncertain at this point of time. So it is the introspection only. One has to think how best we can be able to steer the economy in such a trying time. Now, so far as the impact of COVID-19 on Indian economy is concerned, it is really difficult to have a kind of a reliable estimate. Before that, I would like to say that COVID-19 pandemic is different. Different in the sense that a pandemic like Ebola, SARS, Spanish flu did not spread to the whole world. Now it appears it is a kind of red swan event, a kind of undefined red swan event. It is affecting the whole world and it is catching the mankind by neck, enters into the lungs and kills by choking the respiration if your immunity system is not adequate. So a red swan event is really troubling the mankind and threatening the mankind, and the 21st century mankind was not really prepared to face this kind of problem. So coming to the impact of COVID-19 on Indian economy, I would like to proceed like this. My brainstorming would be life versus livelihood. Early estimates which are available now about the loss of GDP, they are not credible because we do not know what would be the total loss of GDP at this point of time, because we are still in the midst of COVID-19 pandemic. Then we have to discuss about the public policy responses which are unfolding, the immediate relief and rehabilitation and or stimulus. So these are the three aspects which we will be discussing in my presentations. When it comes to life and livelihood, as you know, if there is no life, there is no livelihood also. Jaan hai to jahan hai. Therefore, protecting the life is more important than thinking about livelihood simultaneously. This is one view. The other view is, yes, we have to protect life, but livelihood is also lost. Therefore, we have to secure life and livelihood together. So this is another strand of thought that is emerging now. how best we can be able to secure life and livelihood is the issue. Therefore, one has to be very careful that is there a kind of trade-off between securing life and securing livelihood. If you cannot secure life for your recklessness, then your plan for securing livelihood will go haywire. That is the reason why we have to first secure life, and government has been doing a lot of activities just to secure the life first. That's why the government has taken a very bold decision of lockdown for an extended period, knowing fully well that it is a populous country. If this pandemic will spread, then it will create problem that our medical facility is not sufficient enough to tackle the medical problem. And therefore, there is a trade-off that is already there, trade-off between containing this medical emergency. When I'm talking about containing medical emergency, I mean intensity, spread, as well as duration, and the damage to the economy. Damage to the economy will be more if we extend the lockdown. If we control pandemic, then probably the damage to the economy can also be controlled indirectly to the extent that the spread can be limited. So this is the kind of brainstorming one should have. Now, coming to the public policy response, we will see what is the response so far and what are the response which we expect, reasonably expect for the government to deliver. That's why when I am talking of life and livelihood, I am sharing you the number. This number is changing on a real-time basis. If you just look at the numbers, world now is more than 3 million, more than 3.2 million people have been tested positive. 1 million people have somehow recovered. Casualty is around 2.3 lakh and active cases are close to 2 million. And USA, if you see, more than 1 million people are they are tested positive. The recovery is also 1.47 million kind of thing, and 60,000, more than 61,000 people have died. Active cases are still more than say 8.5 lakh. Now, if you see the major countries which are affected more than 1 lakh who have been tested positive, they are mostly developed countries. Even the developing country, the coronavirus has spread. Compared to these countries, if you see, India's position is not that bad. In the sense, confirmed cases are now little over 33,000 and recoveries are also high at 8,437, and recovery to the positive ratio is around 3.3%. Sorry, this is the recovery is not that low. It is around 26%, and death is around 1,000, which is hardly 3.3% compared to the global average of around 7.1%. So these numbers are changing. What I want to draw a conclusion from this number is India probably could be able to control this COVID-19 pandemic better because of early lockdown and cooperation of the people and its strict implementation. Had there been no such effort by the government as well as by the people, then situation would have been explosive by now. At least the COVID-19 positive cases are increasing linearly rather than exponentially. Our recovery rate is not that bad and casualty is very limited, half of that of the international average. That is the reason why I should say at least we could be able to contain the intensity and spread. We are not very sure about duration. Let us see. Coming to the loss of GDP, one should have a very open mind to see what the others are talking about, whether we are satisfied with the forecast given by other agencies. If you start with the forecast given by the government before the COVID-19 outbreak, we thought that India can be able to grow at 6%. That is, real GDP will grow up to 156 trillion rupees. nominal GDP is likely to grow at 10%. This was on February 1st, 2020, when the budget was presented. Almost close to that, if you see, IMF also projected India's growth is, real GDP growth is likely to be 5.9%. They have also reduced the growth to 1.9%, which is also doubtful. We'll see why it is doubtful. It is mainly doubtful mainly because they have made the estimate before the extension of the lockdown. So when the lockdown was extended, GDP loss ought to be very high. 1.9% positive real GDP growth is not possible at this point of time. Similarly, World Bank also thought India is likely to grow at 5.8% in the month of January. By April 12th, they also revised this real GDP growth to 1.5 to 2.8%. ADB had given some optimistic real GDP growth in April to 4%. If you see Standard & Poor global rating, initially they thought that it will be 3.5 in March when there was outbreak of COVID-19. They have also reduced to 1.8% in April 17. Moody's, they have very recently reduced their projection to 0.2% on April 28. Fitch rating has also reduced. Now, these projections are also tentative in the sense we may not be able to probably achieve positive real growth. So my estimate that I am giving in the next slide is like this. 1920 nominal GDP and real GDP, if you see, nominal GDP and real GDP I have given in two columns. Your nominal GDP 204 trillion, real GDP 147. This is the second advanced estimate. And from the second advanced estimate, probably the estimate that is given for 2020-21 was reasonable in the sense economy was showing some early signs of recovery before the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic. Therefore, economy growing at 6% on a real terms from a low base was probably reasonable. And if you assume 4% inflation, then nominal GDP might have grown by 10%. If you assume these numbers at that point of time to be reasonable, then let us see from this level how much you can be able to come down. If you calculate what would be the loss of GDP for the 40 days lockdown, then you assume three scenarios: 100% loss of GDP during these 40 days, 75% loss of GDP during these 40 days, at least 50% loss of GDP. At least 50% loss in GDP. In nominal terms, GDP is likely to come down at least by 12 trillion, maximum around 25 trillion during these 40 days. After these 40 days also there will be loss of GDP because we are not lifting the restrictions immediately after 40 days. So this is a tentative estimate. Loss is likely to be more than say 25 trillion rupees in nominal terms, but unlikely to be around kind of 75 trillion that people are now projecting. This is the nominal terms 40 days. If this kind of decline in nominal GDP is there, the nominal GDP is given by corresponding GDP and growth rate. The nominal GDP is likely to grow at minus 1.8% if there will be 100% loss of GDP during this 40 days. If at least 50% loss will be there, GDP is likely to grow around 4.3%. If inflation is 4%, real GDP growth will be 0.3. What actually I wanted to show you here, that if 100% loss of GDP, GDP will be growing by minus 5.5%. If 75% loss of GDP will be there, India will be growing by minus 2.6%. If at least 50% loss will be there for these 40 days, nominal, your real GDP will be the same level as it was in last year. And my hunch is that there will be loss of GDP more than this, mainly because GDP will continue to shrink even after 40 days. So it is most likely that this year's real GDP will be in the negative. Now, even if you take these numbers, reduce nominal GDP for this 40 days alone, and you calculate what would be the fiscal deficit this year. Fiscal deficit initially was proposed to be 8 trillion, about 8 trillion. At least 2%, I think your shortfall of revenue will be at least 2 trillion, 1% of GDP, if not more. It may be more than that. Actually, Professor Arun Kumar has told that it will be around 8% instead of 10% of GDP. So 2% means 4 trillion loss will be there in revenue. Possible, but government can be able to make good some of the loss if they can get some revenue from the oil sector, at least 1 trillion or so, prioritization of expenditure, etc. At least there will be loss of revenue to the extent of 2 trillion. And fiscal stimulus that is given so far 1.74 and some additional expenses that they have declared earlier. If you take roughly around 2 trillion, so 8 plus loss of revenue and disinvestment around 2 trillion and 2 trillion stimulus given so far, total comes to 12 trillion. This 12 trillion as a percentage to the reduced GDP works out to 5.5 to 6% of GDP. Means at least fiscal deficit this year, if loss is restricted to this 40 days alone, will be 5.5 to 6%. If we include extra budgetary resources in your fiscal deficit, that is around 1% of GDP, it will be around 6.5 to 7%. Means without any additional fiscal stimulus, the fiscal deficit this year is likely to be 5.5 to 6%, or around 6.5 to 7% if you include extra budgetary resources. This is the kind of fiscal situation. What I wanted to impress upon you is that fiscal space is very much limited. If fiscal space is limited, how can we go about? That is what is the issue that we would like to discuss. Now just see expected fiscal deficit in 2022. Fiscal spending on health infrastructure was announced around 0.515 trillion, 1.74 trillion that was announced around $25 billion. You know about it. So initial stimulus was meant for relief to the poor people. Anyway, this was not sufficient and government is therefore expected to announce a bigger stimulus. So expected gross fiscal deficit in FY21 has already reached 5.5 to 6% of GDP. Previous slide I have shown you. Expected fiscal deficit of the state government is likely to be 3 to 3.5 because they will also take advantage of the escape clause to the extent of 5% of GDP. So if it remains to 3.5%, then general government fiscal deficit has already reached 8.5 to 9.5. If you include extra budgetary resources, it would be 9.5 to 10.5% of GDP. Now this 10.5% of GDP fiscal deficit, household financial savings in India in financial year 18, that is the latest data available, was 10.8%. Household financial saving gross. Net was only 6.5%. Means you cannot be able to finance fiscal deficit from within the domestic savings. How much more fiscal deficit can be financed? That is the issue that one has to be very realistic about it, that we have already exhausted gross household financial saving and government has already taken those into account so far as fiscal deficit is concerned. Let us have a look at it. How to share COVID-19 war losses? This is a kind of war where, as Mr. Arun Kumar has already explained, during the war people are employed. Here is a war where people are unemployed also. Then war losses, when there is a war losses are typically borne by all stakeholders, producers, consumers, laborers, savers, and investors. Government is not the loser. Government is an intermediary. It has to intermediate between rich and poor, make some arrangement through a fiscal deficit for the people to help. Anyway, the burden of the loss has to be borne by joined by all producers, consumers, laborers, savers, and investors. Let us assume that the government has to bear at least 50% of the loss. If you assume that 20 trillion, 25 trillion will be the kind of GDP loss, at least, then 50% comes to about 10 trillion. So 10 trillion, if government can be able to bear, is it possible? Is it possible that 10 trillion, this 10 trillion should be on top of 8 trillion they have already proposed in the budget. Means government has to have a deficit of at least 18 trillion this year. So 18 trillion deficit, the total fiscal deficit might have reached 6% of GDP, 12 trillion. Then 18 minus 12, another 6 trillion, let us see whether government can be able to arrange another 6 trillion rupees deficit. Now, if this 6 trillion government cannot be able to arrange on top of 12 trillion they have already reached, then can it be shared between RBI and the government? Actually, RBI, they have to share the burden, no doubt about it, but fiscal stimulus, monetary stimulus, they are not additive in nature. Fiscal stimulus directly goes to the people. It affects the ability and willingness to work, save and invest directly. And monetary stimulus anyway impacts your stakeholders indirectly through making credit available at a reduced rate of interest. Anyway, let us see what has been done so far. How do public authorities share the burden? The fiscal space is limited. When fiscal space is limited, monetary policy dominates and vice versa. Fiscal space was not available during the global financial crisis. So monetary policy dominated around the world. Mostly developed countries, they went for quantitative easing because there was no fiscal space available. Quantitative easing probably could be able to prevent the economy going to recession, but it could not stimulate growth. This is our experience. But if you see the global experience now, the fiscal deficit, if you see, most of the developed countries have gone for higher level of fiscal deficit. There was no space available for the monetary authority. Normalization of monetary policy, which was started after the global financial crisis, it was incomplete. They could be able to reach zero lower bound in no time. That's why fiscal policy was active in most of the developed countries. Coming to the developing country, they are a little bit reluctant to be as profligate as the developed country, because this both monetary policy and fiscal policy, developing country as a whole, they are cautious. They are cautious, knowing fully well that their credit rating is not very high. It is a fact that developing countries' fundamentals are also fragile. In such a situation, if they become unduly reckless, so far as monetary and fiscal policy is concerned, the posterity will not excuse them, and they may face problem going forward. That's why we find the developing country are a little bit cautious, monetary policy as well as fiscal policy. Come to Indian experience. Indian experience is unfolding. I will give you what the Reserve Bank has been doing. At least so far as the government is concerned, government has done remarkably well to contain the intensity and spread of COVID-19. As I was giving you the international comparison, intensity and spread we have done remarkably well, while duration remains uncertain. We do not know how long this will continue. Therefore, we should not be complacent. Even if lockdown has to be extended, at least in red zone, then probably it is advisable to sacrifice some growth or further growth. Otherwise, it will be unmanageable. A second round effect of COVID-19 may be catastrophic. That's why let us be very honest. Let us not be very complacent. To the extent possible, some reliefs have gone to the poor people, particularly the marginalized section of society. RBI has taken several initiatives to sustain credit flow to all productive sectors besides relief during lockdown. They've given some relief to the borrowers also, and these things I have given in a tabular form. As you know, before this pandemic broke out in India, the long-term repo operation was already there, around 1 trillion rupees. They have already done. Now, after this, outbreak of the pandemic, this, on March 27, Reserve Bank came out with a large number of proposals. You might have seen there was a deep cut in the policy rate, 75 basis point in one go. Reverse repo was reduced by 115 basis point on two occasions, 90 basis point on 27 and 25 basis point on April 17. Then if you come to the other measures, the targeted long-term repo operation. On March 27, 1 trillion rupees. On April 17, 0.5 trillion rupees. Now 1.5 trillion targeted LTRO is meant for the corporate bond, MSME, NBFC, MFI, poorer section of the society. And they have given also 0.5 trillion rupees refinance to NABARD, SIDBI, NSB, so that they can be able to lend to the small and MSME sector and the agriculture. So this is the kind of arrangement that has been done. Now, in addition to that, I think historically, if you see, cutting CRR by 100 basis point and reducing or exempting SLR by 100 basis point together is a historic decision. Never in the history of RBI, CRR and SLR was reduced by 100 basis point each on one occasion. This will make liquidity available to the extent of 1.37 trillion each. Just imagine how much of liquidity Reserve Bank is releasing to the market. Then special liquidity facility for mutual fund for around 50,000 crores. That was done as late as April 27 for 90 days. And one more thing, wage and means advance during last year was 75,000 during the first half of the year. This year, knowing fully well that it will be a crisis situation, initially it was increased to 1.2 trillion. And in April 20, it was increased to 2 trillion rupees wage and means advance. Government can borrow from the RBI 2 trillion rupees up to September 30. And besides that, there was a lot of regulatory forbearances, as you know, for lenders as well as borrowers, so that they will get some relief out of it. So this is the kind of arrangement RBI has made. Broadly, there are certain other things which I am not covering because regulatory forbearances are many. The idea that coming from here, RBI has borne the biggest burden of the relief as well as making liquidity available for making this credit flow to the productive sector as smooth as possible. Now let us see what is the outcome. Outcome of this excess liquidity, if you see, currently excess liquidity in the financial system is around 7 trillion rupees. This 7 trillion rupees may not reach the borrowers, but it is expected to support the short-term interest rate besides pushing up credit growth. This is what our expectation. But the whole problem is banks are risk averse, extremely risk averse, and demand for credit is also sluggish. That is the reason why credit growth is unlikely to go up even if liquidity condition is so comfortable. Now, if you see the yield rate, one would expect the yield rate to come down because of a surfeit of liquidity. But what has happened, the 10-year GSEC, the yield on 10-year GSEC has gone up after March 27 because of massive uploading of GSEC by foreign portfolio investors due to flight to safety. Then fear about overshooting of government borrowing without even additional stimulus. At least 4 trillion will be additional borrowing. Additional borrowing 4 trillion. How I arrive at 2 trillion, maybe shortage of revenue and disinvestment. Another 2 trillion, that fiscal stimulus they have already announced. Another 4 trillion rupees the government has to borrow from the market. That the market has already factored in. That is the reason why even if so much of liquidity is arranged, the yield is not coming down. If yield will remain high, it will defeat the RBI's accommodative monetary policy. RBI's accommodative monetary policy, reducing repo rate by 75 basis point, reverse repo by 115 basis point. All these things will go west if you are not in a position to contain the yield on GSEC. Government is trying, RBI is trying hard to manage this yield on GSEC through Operation Twist, through several other permutation and combination, but yield remains at an elevated level above 6% anyway. Virtually, what conclusion that is emerging, virtually there is no space of borrowing from the domestic market to finance additional fiscal stimulus without increasing the yield rate. This is the kind of scenario that is emerging. Although monetary and fiscal policy stimuli are not effective, a fair amount of burden has been taken by the monetary authority. At least 1.5 trillion targeted long-term repo operation funds and 0.5 trillion refinance are expected to be utilized in a time-bound manner. At least 2 trillion hopefully may be utilized because these are sector-specific and may be utilized in a time-bound manner. If out of 6 trillion, this 2 trillion is utilized because of the policy of the RBI, at least government can be able to arrange remaining 4 trillion, where from it will arrange at least 4 trillion rupees because the market is saturated, domestic market cannot be able to sustain high level of borrowing, where from this 4 trillion will come. Let us see what are the options available. Option to finance bigger fiscal stimulus. People have been suggesting, very influential people are suggesting monetization of deficit and debt. Possibly this may be the last resort. Monetization deficit has its own limitations, and as of now, monetization of deficit is not permissible without the amendment of the RBI Act. Transfer of reserves and contingency fund to the government from RBI. Recently, excess reserves and contingency fund that has been transferred to the government last year as per the Bimal Jalan committee recommendations. Whatever reserves and contingency fund that is there at this point of time, that is the minimum requirement for RBI taking position in the market as well as foreign market. So one can argue that yes, some reserves can be transferred to the government, but the downside may be very high when RBI will incur loss, whether it can be financed through budget deficit. Possibly it is not a kind of desirable option. Enabling corporate debt as eligible collateral for RBI's repo operation. RBI repo operation has been done with the collateral that is government security. If you allow this corporate debt, then you have to open up the Pandora's box. At least RBI has allowed corporate debt as an eligible security for market repo. Now the long-term repo operation, TLTRO funds that has been given to the bank, they can utilize this fund by taking this corporate debt of the NBFC, MSME for lending to the small and medium sectors. But RBI using this corporate debt is a debatable issue, requires a lot of introspection. RBI opening a direct window for specific sectors like NBFC, mutual funds, etc. That has been the demand, but RBI has made arrangement for NBFC mutual fund through commercial bank, and opening a direct window is likely to interfere with the operation of the market, and RBI will emerge as a market maker of the last resort. It is trying to do the role of a market maker of the last resort without compromising the existing rule. Then credit guarantee. There is a credit guarantee fund at this point of time. Some MSME are using this credit guarantee fund, but that is not enough in this situation. Credit guarantee can be given by institutional arrangement. Therefore, again, funds are required. Credit guarantee corporation is probably necessary. So what exactly the situation that is emerging, the downside with these options are very high. Some of the cases, without the amendment of the Act, it cannot be done. If soft options we are not resorting to, then is there any option to finance this at least $4 trillion of financing? Let us see what are the alternative options. These alternative options are financing through extra budgetary resources. Extra budgetary resources is small saving. Where from the small saving will get these funds? Suppose the government will hike ATC benefit under the Income Tax Act from 1.5 lakh to 3 lakh in financial year 21. At least 1.5 crore people are paying tax. Suppose they will save now, instead of 1.5 lakh, they will save 3 lakh, additional 1.5 lakh. Then the total saving, small saving kitty is likely to increase by more than 2 trillion. Government will lose some revenue, maybe around 40,000 crores. If you knock out 40,000 crores from 2 trillion or little more than 2 trillion, at least 1.5 trillion government can get net revenue by increasing the ATC benefit This will help the taxpayer whose income is coming down. At the same time, government will get these extra budgetary resources to the extent of 1.5 trillion. At least they can obviate borrowing from the domestic market. That is one proposal. Second proposal, borrowing from multilateral institutions. As of now, IMF has committed around $4 billion, and ADB has 2.2 billion, and World Bank has committed around $7.5 billion. $7.5 billion comes to about 50,000 crores. 0.5 trillion has been committed. It is better to negotiate with them, even with the new development bank that is there in China, that we can even negotiate more if they can be able to provide more, at least more than 50,000 crores that has been committed. We can think in terms of more resources to be mobilized from multilateral institutions. That is one of the alternatives I am suggesting. Then sovereign borrowing from abroad. Now people are talking about COVID bond. COVID bond in the domestic market, savings are not available. Can we think of a kind of bond in the international market in foreign currency, either directly by the sovereign or by public sector undertaking, PSU, under government guarantee? 10 to 15 billion US dollar COVID bond in the international market may mobilize around 1 trillion rupees. As of now, LIBOR, 10-year LIBOR is around or little less than 0.5 or around 0.5. If sovereign paper can mobilize resources even by paying 2% or even less, then 2.5 is probably not a bad deal to borrow from the international market to the extent of 10 to 15 billion dollars. It can be open to non-residents as well as non-residents, so that this can be subscribed without much of a problem. 1 trillion we can be able to borrow. The only thing that exchange risk has to be borne by the government, and exchange risk as of now is little more than 3.3, around little 3.4, 3.5. So if you add that also, it will be less than 6.5 or 6.4, that is the secondary market yield. Now this is one proposal. Now another is use bilateral swap arrangement. India is having bilateral swap arrangement with Japan to the extent of $50 billion. Can we not mobilize this source to get some funds to the extent of 10 to 15 billion US dollar, another trillion? So all these proposals taken together is coming to around 4 trillion. At least we can mobilize these resources in the international market. So way forward. Now, way forward actually, just have a look at it. The COVID-19 pandemic has changed the world forever. World will not come back to the same world that was there before the outbreak of the pandemic. It would not be business as usual. So unprecedented encroachment on nature will be contained anyway. There is some consciousness about global warming, etc. That was not actually making any headway. After the global pandemic, I think this COVID pandemic, the unprecedented encroachment on nature will be contained. Then social distancing will continue, at least until vaccine is available for coronavirus or therapy is found for the treatment of this disease. So social distancing will continue anyway. When social distancing will continue, then restoring economic activity is a difficult proposition. One has to understand. Restoring the economic activity will be a difficult proposition. So the business model will now be different than it was earlier. And certain sectors like travel, tourism, hospitality, entertainment, retail, live sports like IPL and all other sports, oil and gas, logistics, events and conferences, real estate, fashion industry, these industry will continue to shrink. Till such time social distancing will continue. At least some industries or some sectors have the opportunity to grow. These industries or these sectors are digital products, structured knowledge, online coaching and teaching, healthcare, insurance, network marketing, data science, artificial intelligence, alternative energy, gig economy. Gig economy means somebody can contribute from somewhere and thereby get his livelihood. not necessarily going to the workplace. Now, this kind of model one has to think. So long as social distancing is there, gig economy is likely to play a bigger role. So even if certain sectors are expected to shrink, certain sectors can also flourish under this situation. Now, therefore, globalization, however, may suffer further setback. So globalization will not be as usual earlier. Earlier, there was a lot of man-made restrictions on globalization. Virus has put another spoke that globalization may suffer further setback. But local value chain may survive due to disruption of the global value chain. Global value chain is unlikely to come back to its previous shape in the foreseeable future. Till such time, social distancing will be the norm in the society. Anyway, in India, although we were part of the global value chain, we were not contributing in a big way to the global value chain. Our local value chain was very much there. That's why we could be able to provide the essential commodities to the people those who are affected by the coronavirus. Now the work environment will also change. Wages to be paid according to your productivity, according to your contribution, whether you work from office or work from home. So these are the way forward. Let us see what are the challenges before the government. Phasing out of lockdown is biggest. Phasing out means you have to have social distancing and phase out lockdown. That's why there is a need for strategy. How best you can be able to phase out lockdown, particularly in the areas where the COVID-19 is still active, means these are red zones. Extension of lockdown, if it is warranted in certain areas like Mumbai, like say Chennai, which are the financial center, naturally it will definitely have impact on the GDP. Rehabilitation of migrant workers. These migrant workers are necessary probably where they were needed. Now they have gone back to their native place. They are in the process of going to their native place. They may not come back so quickly. Whether they will be rehabilitated in their own state or they will come back to this place. Social distancing will continue. They will not come back. So what kind of strategy you will follow to rehabilitate these migrant workers? Protection of job. People have lost the job. Otherwise, the unemployment problem was acute. Now people have lost the job. How to protect job and create new jobs? So this is a Herculean task before the government. So these are real sector problem. These are not financial sector problem. Financial sector problem, RBI is taking care. Real sector problem, government has to do a lot of homework rather than fiscal stimulus per se. How the strategy has to be devised to protect jobs, create new jobs, then come to cash flow problem of the corporate. At least something RBI is doing to see how best cash flow problem can be solved. Bankruptcy is anyway a very important issue. Otherwise, corporate sector balance sheet was not good. After this war against coronavirus, bankruptcy is probably looming very large. Many small and medium industry, even big industry, they are facing the bankruptcy challenge. Then fiscal and debt sustainability. Debt sustainability was a problem. Now debt and fiscal sustainability, even if it appears very sound to suggest that government should come out with at least how much 15% of GDP as a kind of stimulus, where from they will bring? Fiscal and debt sustainability will not permit them. Domestic market is saturated. Overseas market also you can borrow at the most 4 to 5 trillion rupees, not more than that. Then inflation risk due to ultra accommodative monetary policy. This is my experience. I had the experience of 2008 global financial crisis. Both monetary policy, fiscal policy, they were accommodative. Ultimately, what has happened? Inflation went up, growth slowed down, and economy had to suffer for several years. The ultra accommodative monetary policy today has an inflation risk going forward. We cannot wish it away anyway, but we have to be very careful. We have to help the economy to tide over the situation. At the same time, clawing back this liquidity from the system will be a difficult task. Reducing CRR by 100 basis point, reducing 1.37 lakh crores is easy. You cannot claw back 1.37 lakh crores in one go, creating problem in the market. Collapse of the external demand will collapse. Only silver lining is that you are facing a kind of oil price which is very low and may provide you some kind of relief so far as external sector or a BOP problem is concerned. Even if external demand is collapsing, at least BOP crisis is unlikely to emerge for two reasons. Your oil demand is high, oil price has come down. Again, you have enough foreign exchange reserve. Then resolution mechanism and financial sector crisis. Resolution mechanism and financial sector crisis, that was an ongoing problem, and this is accentuated because of the recent problem. We have to steer clearly how best we can sustain the resolution mechanism and also protect the financial sector in the times to come. So rebooting the economy requires strategy, mostly real sector strategy, rather than the magnitude of stimulus. The magnitude of stimulus, yes, necessary, but we have to devise the strategy how best we can reboot the economy with the appropriate strategy in the real sector. Seize the opportunity when challenges are daunting. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for sharing your knowledge with us. And thank you, Professor Arun Kumar and Dr. Barender Kumar Bhoy, for taking the time to conduct this session for us. Thank you, sir. So now we'll come to the questions. I have got one question. As usual, very informative with deliberation and critical comments with the help of data, many valid prediction and suggestions. Thank you for the concise and condensed talk by Professor Arun Kumar. Sir, do you think that the workers across the world will be facing the same kind of hardships or those hardships will be of different kind? This is a question by Mr. Ajit Kumar.
So, hardships, as I mentioned in my talk, were different for unorganized sector, agriculture, for, the organized sector. The organized sector has security of tenure. It has got some security of income, but the unorganized sector does not have that. And from agriculture, there is a different kind of a problem. As I said, if the produce does not move to the markets and if the demand for food goes down because there's large-scale unemployment, then their prices collapse. That's what we saw during the demonetization also, and that's what's happening. And that's why vegetables and fruits are rotting in the fields, at the moment. And today also I read the report that, farmers are not able to sell their grains and they're having to sell to the local traders at much reduced prices. So therefore, the kind of crisis we saw after demonetization, that kind of crisis will be there. Now, in the advanced countries, there may be a different kind of a crisis than in the developing world because our governments are not able to support, our health systems are very poor. So in the advanced country, the health systems are rather advanced and they're able to save many lives. But in India, because we have inadequate testing, we don't even know where the disease has spread. And there, the unorganized sector and the workers in the rural areas, they will suffer a lot if the disease is already spread because we will not be able to provide them. So, the situation in the poorer countries is much more precarious for the poor people, for the unorganized sector, for the farmers, than in the advanced countries where the systems are far more developed. So we need to have a nuanced understanding of the situation of what government needs to do to protect the workers of different segments of society.
So there is next question from Siddharth Rao. Siddharth, you can unmute yourself and ask the question.
So my question is that now credit is cheaper than ever because of the new RBI norms. And due to the political game, we won't see the raise in interest rates anytime soon. So after the pandemic is over, the large organizations will regrow and even at a faster rate due to the credit boost they are going to get. but the informal sector is the one who's unable to reap benefits of such policies. So do you think they would be able to revive, and or the gap would increase between the income of people in formal and informal sector? And is there any way that we can reduce this gap?
So, my take is that credit being cheap does not mean necessarily that investment will go up, because demand is not there. If you are working at 25%, 40%, or even 60%, and, for instance, before the pandemic came, the RBI data showed that Indian industry was working at only 70% or less than 70% capacity utilization. So investment was already weak. So in a sense, lowering the interest rates or keeping money cheap is not going to revive unless businesses begin to work and capacity utilization goes up to 85 or 90%. So I don't see any revival soon. And that's why I have been saying that the rate of growth will be minus 35%, because starting from minus 70% in the lockdown period, if you recover even to back to January 2020 within a year, your rate of growth will be minus 35%, during the year. So, I don't see a fast revival even of the organized sector manufacturers. But you're right that, as production revives, it will be more the organized sector that will revive rather than the unorganized sector, because unorganized sector is very difficult to reach. And let me say that the MSME sector has micro sector, which is 99% of the MSME sector, and they're getting credit there is very, very difficult. And that's why the micro sector has been suffering even before the pandemic came. And digitization, etc., is not something that the micro sector is able to deal with. So you're absolutely right that the gap between the cottage sector and the small sector and the larger sector, the organized sector, the medium and the large scale sector, that gap will increase. But let me also say that at the moment I see a lot of trouble because we are into a depression at the moment. So next 3, 4, 5 years will be a huge Herculean task, because in spite of everything that the RBI may do, provide liquidity, give cheap credit, etc., etc., cut the CRR to give more liquidity. In spite of that, unless capacity utilization in the organized sector comes up to 85% or so, investment will not revive, and if investment doesn't revive, growth will not revive. So I think we are in for a very long haul. It's not going to be easy. And one suggestion that Mr. Boy made was that we could borrow, under 80C. But the incomes of the organized sector workers, government workers also will come down dramatically. Government, I think, is likely to cut incomes. Already the DA has been cut. Private organized sector will also cut incomes. So savings, as I was arguing, that this savings will be there. So there'll be no savings actually to put into the special things that the government may want to do, and corporate savings will also go down dramatically. And as I said, asset prices will come down, whether it be mutual funds, stocks, real estate, etc. So there'll be a wealth effect, and that will further impair the capacity of the private sector to be able to subscribe to bonds, etc., which government might float. So all told, I think we are into a very messy situation where monetary policy will not work, fiscal policy will not work, etc., etc. So I think we are in a problem or in a crisis for the long haul. But maybe Mr. Boy may present a slightly different view.
Next question is for Mr. Boy. IMF has projected a growth rate of 1.9% for India as against a 3% shrink for the rest of the world, excluding China. Is it a positive reflection of the measures taken by the Indian government to deal with the pandemic?
No, because 1.9% growth was projected during the first phase of the lockdown. They had no clue whether government of India will extend this lockdown beyond the 21 days. So during that period, April 10 precisely, they released this World Economic Outlook. And before this World Economic Outlook was released, RBI released the Monetary Policy Report. Monetary Policy Report used to give projection of growth and inflation for the ensuing year. When they found that uncertainty is very high, they kept quiet. They did not put any hard number so far as growth and inflation projections are concerned. So because of the extension of this lockdown, So this year's real GDP growth will definitely be negative. It is unlikely to be positive. So IMF has to revise this 1.9% positive real GDP growth in their next or mid-term review, or at least by October they will anyway revisit this World Economic Outlook. 1.9 is just not possible. Not even if we can remain at the last year's level so far as the real GDP is concerned, that would be an achievement by itself. In my assessment, that after 40 days, loss of GDP will continue because the major centers like Mumbai, metropolitan centers and big centers where this COVID-19 is yet to be controlled, their lockdown will continue. Lifting of the lockdown will take more time. So GDP loss will be more than the projection that I have given in my estimate. As you go along, the loss of GDP will be more, but it may not be as high as around 35% of kind of thing. My feeling is that we have our infrastructure very much there. Agriculture is likely to grow at 2 to 3% or even more than that, 3.5%, because monsoon is likely to be normal. It is not very much affected. So far as services sector and the manufacturing sector is concerned, infrastructure is very much there. But as soon as we restrict the spread and duration of COVID-19, they may come back to normal activities as soon as possible. That is the reason why I am telling duration has to be contained, intensity and spread has been somewhat contained, and government should try to establish normalcy as early as possible. We have capacity with us, we can be able to produce and thereby reduce the impact on GDP. If we are successful in controlling the spread of COVID-19, probably its impact can be moderated on the real economy. Real economy, if it grows by say -1% or so, it's okay. I think that would be a kind of achievement. That is what actually my take on this impact on GDP is concerned. Possibly it may be more if we cannot be able to control that. What is the need of the hour is that people should provide unstinted support to contain the spread of the disease, rather than ask for around 15-20%, 20 to 30% of GDP as fiscal deficit, which is not a kind of a proposition that can be implemented. It's just not possible. Okay.
Can I add something to it?
Yeah.
Hello. Can I add?
Sure.
You see, suppose your lockdown is there for 2 months, and then it's released. So you'd have lost you'd have lost about 70% of the output for these 2 months. So and then suppose you recover within 1 year from that. So you go back to where it was in January 2020, say within 1 year. Then you'd be going from -70% to 0% rate of growth over a period of 10 months. And that's why the average for the year would come to -35%. So unless you believe that you will recover within 2 months like a V-shaped thing, and you go back to January 2020 within 2 months, as soon as the lockdown is lifted, and of that there's no chance, because workers have gone back. There'll be shortage of skills. You'll be having dispersed production. Your airlines, your hotels, your restaurants, large segments of the economy are going to be down because investment will be down. Consumer confidence is down, so people will not be buying as many cars and refrigerators and so on as before. Then secondly, demand will be down, because you see incomes have been lost, so demand will be down dramatically, and when demand is down, then production will not take place. So therefore I'm saying the glide path will be 1 year. Now if you go from -70% to 0% in 1 year, then you can see that the average will be -35%. It cannot be -1 or -2%. So even if you assume that within 2 months you recover back to say January 2020, that means you go from -70% to 0%, within a short space of 2 months, and then you grow at the rate of say 4.5%, which was the rate of growth in January 2020. Even then, you still have -15% rate of growth, because -70% for 2 months and then 4.5% for 10 months will be down to roughly like -15% rate of growth. So there's just no way of 1.9% or -1 or -2%. We are into a depression. The sooner we face this problem that we are in depression. Unfortunately, what's happening is large number of academics and experts are confusing the situation, and they're saying that as if we are going to be going back within 1 month or 2 months back to where we were in January 2020. There are no signs of that. In fact, there's a fear that if there's a second round of attack, then things will again slow down. So that's why I'm being very charitable and saying, suppose within 1 year, we are able to recover back to where we were in January 2020. And there's no chance of that also, because consumer confidence is down, investment sentiment is down, capacity utilization is very low. So investment is not going to revive. Government will not have the space, the fiscal space to increase public investment, because it'll be completely bogged down by taking care of the pandemic. And as I said, 50% of the population has now fallen below poverty line. They don't have work, so they have to be supported. And if you support them at half the World Bank poverty line, of the extreme poverty line, that means you give them $0.85 per person per day. That'll mean 18 lakh crores. And because your production will be down -35%, your tax collection will fall by 22 lakh crores at least. At the moment, GST collection is less than 10% of what it was in the corresponding period last year. So GST collection will be way down. Your incomes will be way down. Your businesses will fail. So the corporation tax collection will be way down. Because your incomes will be way down in the organized sector. Therefore, your income tax collection will be down. That's why I'm saying your tax GDP ratio, which was 16% last year, will come down to something like 8% in the year. So when you take a consistent point about what's happening in the economy, then only you realize the extent of the crisis. If you mix up, some things you mix up from what was happening last year to this year, it's not going to be that last year will be repeated this year for 10 months. If you mix up, then only you get a figure of 1.9%, which the IMF is saying, but that will require a 16% rate of real growth for the remaining months, and that's not going to happen. So I think we have to be a consistent analysis, and that is where I've been saying it's a -35% rate of growth. If you recover, from lockdown in 2 months and then go to where the January 2020 position was in the remaining 10 months.
Next question is coming from Hardik Sharma. Hardik, please unmute yourself.
Good morning, sir. So, as many journalists and many economists are championing the cause of MSME, but the problem with this term is that even though we are considering the micro, small, and medium enterprise as a one single unit when we are talking of this term, but the number of people employed in the micro and small enterprises outnumber by a very huge margin the number of people employed in the medium enterprises. And so many economists are saying that there is an urgent need to shift the people in the small and micro underperforming enterprises towards the medium and large enterprises as soon as possible. Otherwise, India will not be in a position to face any such pandemic in the near future. But sir, what can be the policy instrument that the government can adopt to bring about this structural change?
So you are absolutely right. When I looked at the data, 2015 data on MSME, then micro sector is 99% of the units. Small and medium are only 1% of the units. Micro sector has about 6 crore units. So small and medium has roughly about 6 lakh units. And the employment in the micro sector is 97.5% of the MSME employment. That's what the 2015 data suggests. Now, therefore, the micro sector is something that the government is unable to reach, because when it says MSME, it's thinking of the small and the medium sector, but not the micro sector. The government is unable to reach the micro sector. Even the Mudra scheme is not able to give enough to the micro sector to revive it. The average that is being given under the Mudra scheme is only 47,000, and the average employment in the micro sector is only 1.7. So that 47,000 will not be enough to even give one job. And because they would have eaten up their working capital, because for them, whatever is their working capital, they would have consumed, because they have no income at the moment, and therefore they would have no capital to really restart the entire process. So it'd be very difficult for the government to reach them by what they call the MSME policy. You need to distinguish between micro and small and medium. You need to disaggregate and have separate policy for the micro sector. Now, this harebrained idea that you can convert the micro sector into small and medium, micro sector is not there because they don't want to work in the other areas. Micro is there because there's so much automation in the medium and the large scale sector that there are really no jobs being generated there. So if you look at the organized private sector in the economy, then in 1990-91 they employed 7.5 million, and today they're employing 12 million, but the workforce has increased from then when it was 200 million to 450 million. So 250 million people additional have come into the workforce, but only 4 million have got jobs in the organized private sector, and the public sector has been declining. So the reason why people are there in the unorganized sector, in the micro sector, is because there's just no jobs being generated given the automation that's taking place in the large and the medium scale sector. Even many units in the small scale sector are getting automated, so even they are not generating the kind of jobs that are needed. So therefore the micro sector or the unorganized sector are residual sectors because people are not able to shift out, to the organized sector. Therefore they're working desperately in the unorganized sector. Their education skills are also low. They don't have the availability of technology. So it's a harebrained idea that we convert the micro sector into a large scale and the medium scale and the better off small scale sector. That's not going to happen unless we talk about technology, unless we talk about the fiscal policies, unless we talk about the macro level of investment in the economy. And our investment has been coming down. It had peaked at about 37% in 2012. It has come down to roughly 28%. So when the investment is falling, it's not that you're going to create a lot more jobs in the micro sector or the other sectors of the economy. So I think it's a macro problem that needs to be taken into account. Otherwise, we will not be able to deal with the people who are working in the unorganized sector. And therefore, as I've been saying, we need a survival package today. The survival of the large number of workers, the survival of the small businesses and the micro businesses, that has become crucial, because if the micro businesses collapse, then 99% of the employment of the MSME will be affected. And therefore, there'll be large-scale unemployment, there'll be large-scale poverty, and you could have food riots. The only good thing that the pandemic has done is that all commodity prices have crashed. For instance, oil prices have crashed, and therefore inflation is unlikely to be very high, except where there are bottlenecks. So if food is not able to reach from villages to urban areas, then there could be rise in the prices in urban areas, but there'll be a collapse of prices in the rural areas. So I think in a depression, your worry is deflation rather than inflation. So you can have sectoral problems, but otherwise prices are going to drop. So this is something that's a macro level problem that we need to deal with very specifically, and we need to support the people who are losing work in the unorganized sector. Otherwise, there'll be food riots, there'll be social collapse. So this is the kind of survival package that I was talking about, where you help the workers, you help the small businesses and micro businesses, and you take care of the medical emergency. Government resources will be enough only for these things. There's no other availability of resources because the economy is not producing. So the resource base is not there. And you can't even get funds from abroad because everywhere the crisis is there. Where is the funds? The crisis is there in America, it's there in Germany, it's there in Japan. So how will you be able to get funds from there? It's going to be a huge challenge, because everywhere the incomes would drop. In America, the rate of growth has already dropped to -4%, and in the next quarter, it'll probably be down by -10 or 12%, given that 30 million people have already lost jobs. So I don't think any country is going to be able to come and support our government. We have to find our internal resources to do a survival package.
There are many questions coming from the Facebook live telecast, and one of the question is regarding the freezing of dearness allowances. This question is coming from Dr. Indrajit Jha from Political Science Department. He wants to ask whether freezing of dearness allowance up to 2021, is it going to improve the current economic situation or will worsen it, as it will reduce the purchasing power of the people?
So, my view is that at the moment, government just will not have resources to even pay the full salaries of its workers, given that it must first, fund the survival package. So I think salary cuts are coming. Private sector will cut salaries and the government will cut salaries. And the reason is that, your production will be down by roughly about 70 lakh crores of rupees for the year as a whole. So the economy will just not have the resources to pay everybody what it was paying, say, in January 2020. And therefore, the demand problem that will be there as a result of cut in salaries in the organized sector, we must balance that with the need to support the unorganized sector. That should be our first priority. At least the organized sector will have some income. The unorganized sector, which has collapsed, will have no incomes. So I think there has to be a rebalancing, so we can't think about, what impact on demand it will have. The demand would have collapsed anyway, and the unorganized sector demand has collapsed anyway. So I think we need to worry about the overall balance, about the availability of resources, and within that, think about the government servant salaries and the DAs, etc. So I think we have to have a social view rather than a self-centered view that, give us our salary, even if the economy doesn't have the resources. So I think salary cuts will become imperative. I think there'll be a lot of other things that will also have to be cut from government expenditure, like meetings and seminars and travel, etc., because they'll have to save whatever money they have. They're going to be facing a huge shortfall of resources in the government.
Next question is coming from Deepak Tenguria. Deepak, please unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone. My question is to Professor Arun, sir. Sir, my question is specifically regards to what impact of the COVID-19 will take to the media sector, particularly the print media. Are we in a stage to say that gone are the days when there will be newspapers or paper newspaper actually? So, and we have seen the Sunday team has been totally fired off. So, what will impact it make on the media sector?
So you're absolutely right. I think media is already suffering. Advertisements are down. A large number of people are not buying the newspapers because they're afraid that, there may be virus sticking to it. And that's where, you find the size of the papers have shrunk. Even Times of India, a very prosperous paper, has ended its second section. It's, shrunk from 35 pages to barely 14, 15 pages. Advertising revenue is down everywhere. So I think media is in deep crisis. Salaries in number of media companies have been cut to half because they can't sustain it. And that's, I think, going to happen in almost the entire organized sector, not just media. But the challenge will be that, media will come under greater control of the government, because government advertising may continue. Government may still have some resources. So I think, it's a very dangerous situation because we need a free media. We don't need a media which is under the thumb of the government. So, I have a lot of, I'm very worried about what's going to happen to media. It is going to be a lot of, I think, papers and channels will close down over a period of time because this crisis is going to continue. If output is down by 70 lakh crores, as I anticipate, and that's an optimistic guess, then, there'll be crisis in number of industries. I think a lot of airlines will shut down. A lot of media houses may go under. Various other, entertainment, restaurants, various other sections also will go down very badly in the coming 3, 4, 5 months.
There is next question coming from Dr. Baljit Kaur. This question is to Mr. Bhoi, Dr. Bhoi. After COVID-19 pandemic, how government will prioritize the sector? How government will revive the construction sector like MSME and other small sectors?
Government has proposal for the revival of the real estate sector. That was already there before the pandemic also. The whole idea is first restore the activities. If you restore the activities, probably market will take care of itself. If you cannot restore the activities, if you continue to have lockdown, you will continue to have social distancing, probably that will create problem for the loss of GDP. So any loss of GDP estimates are guesstimated at this point of time. That is what is the issue. Issue is we have infrastructure very much there in this system. If you restore the activities, people will probably put more effort to do the work and at least partially make good the loss sustained by them. The loss of GDP is permanent. At least it should not spill over to loss of demand. That is the reason why we are thinking about these packages, stimulus packages. At least demand should not be lost. The idea is that if at all people can work in an environment where there is no fear. The fear is coming from social distancing, lockdown. If government can restore it, this is a real sector problem. money is not probably is as important as restoring economic activity in the system. There the government has to play a very constructive role, both state government and central government. It's not a kind of taking a partition line. Independence of media is not the issue. Issue is restore economic activities. Then people will be forced to work. It is forced entrepreneurship. 90% of our economy is informal sector. They have to anyway work, but you allow them to work. How you allow them to work? Restore economic activities. There lies your role. I think if that can be done quickly, then I am not very pessimistic that there will not be V-shaped recovery.
You know, I think the real estate sector has been in a crisis for the last 6 to 7 years, and there's been a lot of excess supply of housing and of commercial property, etc. And what has happened now is a complete collapse of that. And especially, you know, if the incomes decline, then, you know, you're not going to have people buying real estate, you know. So I think the real estate crisis will continue for quite some time. And, you know, there'll be an asset price deflation, just like the stock market declined. So even though the stock market has revived to a certain extent, but all asset prices will decline. As businesses fail, they will vacate property and that property will come into the market, but there'll be nobody to really buy that. So as long as the asset prices decline, whether they be of stock market, whether they be of the real estate, etc., you'll find that the demand for real estate will not revive, and therefore the construction activity will also remain muted. You know, we must distinguish between the real estate and the construction activity. So I think, you know, this problem will persist for quite some time. And, you know, given the possibility of a second, you know, attack, a lot of workers from the rural areas will not come back to urban areas. And there are a large number of people in the construction activity who have come from the rural areas. So even if you want to revive activity, it may be difficult to revive activity in the construction sector, in the factory sector, etc. And people will be looking for work in the rural areas, you know, like MGNREGS, you know, the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. And that's why the demand in the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme has increased. That is exactly what happened after demonetization also, where the demand for Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme doubled and tripled within a space of 1.5 years. So, you know, people did not come back after demonetization also to the urban areas. And now because of the fear and the possibility of a second round, many workers are not going to come back. And already, you know, some factories are reporting that, you know, even when they wanted to restart work, they don't have the workers because many workers have migrated. Many factory owners are saying, we don't have facilities to allow people to live there or to have food there in the factory. So they have to be where they are. And then the chances of spread are there because we don't have testing. And therefore, you know, industries saying, even in America, that our liability has to be reduced. So just yesterday's news from America was that American businesses are saying, look, if the disease comes back and it spreads, we'll be sued by the consumers, we'll be sued by our workers. So we want liability to be reduced. So there are real fears because of which there is just no chance that we'll have a V-shaped recovery. It's going to be a very gradual U-shaped recovery over maybe 4 or 5 years. So I think we're in it for a long haul. The sooner we realize that and we plan for it, the better off we are. If we, you know, delude ourselves by saying there'll be a V-shaped recovery within 2 months or 3 months, we'll be back to where we were, you know, in January 2020. I think we may commit a huge mistake, and that will be very, very expensive mistake, both in terms of disease and in terms of livelihoods, you know. So I think we have to plan very cautiously. And there's a principle called the precautionary principle, you know, which is a very philosophical kind of a thing. Precautionary principle says, you know, whatever can go wrong will go wrong. And therefore you have to prepare for it, you know. So you have to protect livelihood and you have to protect health, as Mr. Boyce said in the initial this thing. And you have to find an optimum policy. The optimum policy cannot be that we go back to where we were in January 2020 very quickly, because the disease can spread very quickly after that. We don't have enough testing. We don't even know who's infected, you know. So look at Azadpur Mandi. Azadpur Mandi started working. It was extended to full working. And within days, you found large number of people getting infected, you know, because you don't have testing. So you don't know who's coming in and who's going. And when that happened, you had to lock down. And then, you know, the whole of Delhi is locked down. Now there's a 30% shortage of fruits and vegetables in Delhi. So this kind of thing, if it keeps happening, we'll be in a huge problem because many people will die and livelihoods will anyway go. So I think we have to go by the precautionary principle, go very cautiously, even if it means that livelihoods are lost for a while. And that's why I'm saying we need a survival package in which everybody survives. Agriculture can go back to working full, but agriculture will also need support. So we have to be very careful about what we do in the coming months. It's not going to be easy at all.
Thank you, sir. Now we have a couple of questions, but a restriction of time. So, sir, can we end?
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Professor Arun Kumar and Dr. Barender Kumar Bhoy for taking out time for us. Thanks a lot, sir.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye to everybody.